Hey, glad to be here with you all. Great crowd. My name's Anthony Flacaveno. I'm from a little town in southwestern Virginia, Abingdon. I have a small farm and do economic development work there. So thank you all again for being here. I'm going to talk about this issue from a rural perspective, from a farmer, but also more broadly a rural perspective. I live in an area that was once kind of populist and democratic and now is deeply red, as we like to say. But I'm going to start with a bit of context, kind of put it into more of an economic context to begin, just real quickly. This graph right here, you see those two bars, they show the change in the population of the United States from 1980, when we had about 230 million people, to roughly the present, 2016, when we had 320 million people. 1980 was the year Ronald Reagan was elected to his first term. During that exact same All right, now check those out again. That's how much we grew population-wise, about 42, 43%. Our economy, adjusted down for inflation, grew almost threefold. Now what that means is that during that period of time, when you say the economy is 3 times bigger, that means 3 times more goods and services being produced and sold, 3 times more money moving through the economy. So the biggest question in all of this from an economic point of view is, where did that all go? If the population grew this much, the economy grew this much, why aren't most of us much better off? Okay, so that's the broader framework. And we know the basic answer to that is because almost all of that went to the top of the top, right? But it's also the fact that we are agriculture, and the entire question of a Green New Deal is saddled with a bipartisan commitment to an endless growth economy. That's what we got. And endless growth doesn't work well for people, it doesn't build wealth, and it sure doesn't work for the ecosystem. So within this larger economy based on growth at all costs, continuous growth, endless growth, is our food and farming system. And it's essentially a subset of that, a microcosm of it. And it's based on a model of extraction. You extract from the health of animals by putting hogs and chickens and beef cattle in tiny cages and getting the most out of them in the least amount of time. You extract from farm workers like Lucas Benitez, that I had the privilege to meet a few years ago, led the Immokalee Farm Workers Coalition, because farm workers in Florida were getting paid a penny a pound to pick tomatoes. That means if you pick 2 tons of tomatoes a day, you get 40 bucks. But not just the farm workers, but farmers like my buddy Martin Miles from Lee County, Virginia, who were also caught in this extractive, low-pay system. And a big piece of that, like the broader economy, again, is the fact that so much of the agricultural system and the rural development system has been concentrated, that we have essentially decided to give a pass to corporate mergers and monopolization over the last 30-plus years, and as a result, groups like Tyson and a few others essentially call all the shots. What are the results of that? Well, from an ecological point of view, the soil, which when we talk about how to talk with farmers, farmers understand soil. They may not talk regenerative agriculture, but they do talk soil. Well, the soil, rather than being a sink, it becomes a source. It's a source of pollution downstream. It's a source of nitrogen and phosphorus in the Gulf of Mexico and everything in between. And it's a source of carbon, right? It's contributing. So all of us environmentalists talk about how agriculture is part of the problem. That's because farmers are forced into this kind of low-wage system. And it isn't just farmland. A lot of the East Coast, certainly the Appalachians, but even up into New York State, really it's more forest than farms. It's a mix of the two. In the rural areas, we've gotten into this model where basically we overuse our ecological capital, like when we clear-cut Appalachian hardwood forests, but at the same time we undervalue them. So we get maximum ecological damage and minimum economic benefit because we ship the products out of the area with almost no value added, so the local community gets the bad and not the good. And so as a result of those things and a lot of other things, Fox News and Breitbart and all that crap, as a result of it, we have gotten to the point where rural people generally, especially coal miners, and I'm from a coal mining region, but also farmers, believe me, they hate environmentalists. They hate the EPA. They think you're their enemy. A lot of them. Not the little hippie farmers like me, but a lot of regular old farmers. That's what they think. They think that that regulations are not working. They're just trying to control them. It's the nanny state and all of that narrative. And then fundamentally, as we move into this, we have to understand that just more information is not going to persuade rural people and farmers and a lot of working folks generally. We have to understand that in rural communities, livelihood is the way people think about the environment. Many folks, the environmental movement has a lot of great people in it, but primarily it's driven by urban and suburban people. And the experience of the environment, the ecosystem, is primarily one we go into to be regenerated. We go in there to hike and to camp and to recreate and get spiritually recharged. But in rural areas, that's not what the environment's for. It's how you make a living, right? It's getting old logs like we do and sawing them up for wood heat. It's raising a little bit of food, it's fishing, it's hunting, it's all of that. So it's led to what Catherine Kramer in her book calls a politics of resentment. And again, I totally recognize that much of that has been stoked and cultivated by a tremendously well-funded false narrative on the right, no doubt about that. But it's also true that people have legitimate frustrations, and this resentment has then come to focus on what they consider to be elites. And again, that's kind of us, or you. But that's only one part of the picture. That's only one part, because the work that I've been fortunate to do, and lots of other people all over the country, rural and urban, and I've worked in urban areas as well, but mostly in rural, shows that something else is possible. This guy right here is one of my best buddies in the world, John Mullins. He was one of the first tobacco farmers to join our effort to create what was the first food hub in the Appalachian region, where you aggregate produce. And John, born and raised in Lee County, Virginia, tobacco farmer his whole life. Here he is. He's in front of some of our boxes at our packing house, proudly holding 3 tomatoes. He was raising 10, 12 acres of tomatoes while smoking a cigarette. And so this image is kind of like, this is who we need to reach if we really want to penetrate that universe. We got to figure out ways that a guy like John will see us as an ally and not as an enemy. When we do that, we begin to reach all kinds of farmers. And we know that another issue in this whole question of the Green New Deal is what's the role of animal agriculture? And I hope we get to talk about that in Q&A. But it sure isn't as simple as meat is bad. It's all about how the landscape is managed. And when you manage it like Paul Rizzo is doing here, or you manage it with multi-species that keeps your weeds down and creates multiple streams of nutrients and builds the soil health simultaneous, you're sequestering carbon, you're pulling it out of the atmosphere where we've got too much, and you're putting it in the soil. And you got healthier meat and healthier milk and healthier eggs when you get them from animals like that. Folks like me who raise fruits and vegetables on my little farm, a lot of it comes down to how do we keep something growing on the landscape at all times? How do you keep the soil covered? Rodale did a 13-year study on a low-till organic rotation for grain production, and they found that they were pulling enough carbon that if we transitioned all of U.S. Farmland, cropland, we'd be the equivalent of taking 158 million cars off the road. This is another picture from my little farm. This is an organic no-till, where you're raising a cover crop, you're killing it in place, not with an herbicide, and then planting directly into it, in this case broccoli plants. And we're seeing it all over and come into the, I was really glad to follow Steve, because it's also a question very much of land ownership. So land is relatively cheap where I am in Southwest Virginia, although the prices are rising steadily. But really it is a question of who is owning the land. That's partly a question just keeping it in farming fundamentally, and it's also a question of who gets it. I'm sure you all are very cognizant of the phenomenal loss of black-owned farmland in this country over the last century, somewhere between 85 and 90% of all. So people like Dennis Derrick with Corbin Hill Food Project, people like Shirley Sherrod, specifically trying to reclaim some of that farmland is absolutely critical. The other thing is the ownership structure of the farm enterprises. So most of the farmers I work with are small independent farmers, but there is a slight emergence of producer cooperatives, like New South Co-op in western Arkansas that I got to work with a few years ago, mostly young farmers, very encouraging. A couple more slides and I'm done. The other thing we got to remember too is that the part of how we get beyond this resentment is that farmers and foresters and fishermen, they feel like what they hear from the environmental movement all the time is, don't do what you're doing, or we're going to stop you, we're going to keep you from doing the bad stuff that you do that ruins the environment. And not only is it true that you can transition tobacco farmers and other less sustainable farmers, but also in forest practices. We had a business for quite a few years in which we were managing forests sustainably, like truly sustainably. The image on the left, Jennifer and Sherry Wagner, that's their forest land in Washington County, Virginia, after we had completed a timber harvest job. And we took the logs from their property and others, we sawed them locally, we kiln dried them, we made them into hardwood flooring and sold them as a sustainable brand. It's one of many examples of where we think of our forests, our fisheries, and our farmlands having potential as being working landscapes. They're contributing their most fundamental ecological value, but they're also making products for us. If we move in this direction, here's the deal. Right now we have, by estimates, it's hard exactly to know, about 850 gigatons of carbon in the atmosphere. 850 gigatons. A gigaton, I think, is a billion metric tons, I believe is what it is. That's a lot of carbon, right? But we have, at the same time, 3 times that much carbon in our soils worldwide. 3 times. And here's the trick. Over the last 60, 70 years, maybe a couple hundred years, depending on how you look at it, we've given up half or more of our soil carbon. So that 2,700 gigatons we have now is less than half of what it was historically before we started tearing up the Great Plains and opening up the farmland of Argentina and Brazil. We have tremendous potential and an urgent need to use these working landscapes of pasture land, of croplands, and of forests as sinks. We need to return them to that value, and it's going to take money. It's going to take private money like you get through slow money. It's going to take public investment, and it's going to take investment not only in helping farmers get to the right practices, because as Steve said, it's expensive to make these transitions, to do it the right way, but we got to invest in the food system infrastructure that allows farmers to get a better price, because one of the reasons why farmland is sold off is because it's not profitable to farm for most people. So unless we can make farming really profitable, a decent living for the farmers and the farm workers, then it's always going to be this tremendous pull of development to take it out of farmland. I'll say briefly, I recently joined Farmers and Ranchers for a Green New Deal. It's a brand new initiative, but I'll just say in passing that I think it's going in the right direction, because Farmers and Ranchers for a Green New Deal is trying to pull in not just the sort of mini farmers on the outskirts of big cities, but traditional farmers and ranchers as well. It's a good vehicle. So that's it. Thanks.